Okay, everyone, we are going to take a look at some of the parts at the beginning of the biology unit, chapter 3. The objectives that we're going to be taking a look at in chapter 3, which is in a review of biology. We're going to take a look at cell theory, the structure and function of the cell membrane, including regulation of materials into and out of the cell, the various cytoplasmic organelles, DNA replication, how protein synthesis works, the stages of the cell cycle in order, which you should remember from lab, and then how a cell differentiates and becomes more specialized. In this particular part, we're going to be looking at cell theory and the structure and function of the cell membrane. What we're not going to look at in this particular video is the regulation of materials into and out of the cell. So we're going to stop there. So we're going to take a look at cell theory and structure and function of the cell membrane. These are some definitions and terms that you should be familiar with when you get done taking a look at chapter 3. So if you go back through at the end of this, at the end of chapter 3, and you see some words that you're not familiar with, then this is where you should go back to and then go into your lab manual, go into your textbook, and get the definitions of those. So again, the first part is cell theory, objective 1. Now, cell theory is the fact that the cell is the smallest unit of life. I'm going to refer you back to this picture right here. And this, remember, is the levels of organization. So we took a look at the atom and the molecule in chapter 2. We're going to take a look at the organelle in chapter 3. But to discuss cell theory, we're going to take a look at the cell. Now, why again is the cell highlighted in this graphic image? Because the cell is the smallest component you can have and still be considered a living thing. Organelles are not alive, molecules are not alive, atoms are not alive. However, cells are. So that's why it's highlighted in yellow. Now, another part of the cell theory is all organisms are made of one or more cells. You're not going to see an organism that's only made of organelles, right? So in order to be considered a living thing, it has to be at least one cell, or there could be multicellular. You as humans are multicellular. Things that would be single-celled would be something like bacteria, maybe an amoeba, a protist, things like that. Those are considered single-celled organisms. Cells come from other cells. We've talked about this previously. Go back to chapter 1. We've talked about mitosis versus meiosis in terms of what's created. Mitosis occurs in somatic cells. Now, somatic cells is basically every cell in the body except gametes. Gametes being sperm and egg cells. Somatic cells, when the cells are fixing to die, they get replaced by new genetically identical cells. That's mitosis. Now, meiosis, which is one we're not really going to talk much about in this class, meiosis is when a sperm and an egg cell come together to form a new organism. That's something that you're going to talk about more in anatomy too. Hopefully, you should recognize, it's a funny, but hopefully you guys should recognize these cells here in addition to the cute little faces that are in there. But if I was to ask you what tissue type are you seeing, you should recognize this as adipose tissue. Looking at the second objective, we're going to take a look at the structure and function of the cell membrane, including the regulation of materials into and out of the cell. Now, again, we're not going to do that in this particular video. We're just going to look at the structure and function of the cell membrane. And in case you all needed another way of saying what's going on with the cell membrane, you can take a look at Armando Hasudigan. I didn't spell his last name because it's a tough one to spell. There's a handout that I'm going to post that's going to be something you can follow along with, and it just talks about the lipid bilayer. So what is the cell membrane? The cell membrane, also known as the plasma membrane, is, hopefully you remember from lab, if this is the nucleus and you've got all your organelles inside the cell there, such as your mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, things like that, this is the cell membrane or the plasma membrane. And it's made up of a phospholipid bilayer. Going back to the previous chapter, we talked about phospholipids and about how they are a type of lipid. The phospholipid was made up of a glycerol molecule and two fatty acid chains. The fatty acid chains are hydrophobic, meaning they don't like water. The glycerol with the phosphate group attached, that's where the phospholipid part comes in, they are hydrophilic, meaning they like water. So this particular molecule that makes up the cell membrane is made up of both a part that likes water and a part that doesn't like water. So it's different from other lipids, because most lipids, when you hear lipids, you think, okay, they don't like water at all. But this particular structure, actually, part of it does like water and part of it doesn't. And you get a bunch of these all lined up in a row. So it's a phospholipid bilayer, which means we actually have two layers of phospholipids where the tails are together and the heads are sticking out. So this zone right here, where the tails are, that's the hydrophobic zone. Water doesn't like to pass through that, okay? It doesn't like water. So if you've got a water molecule on one side, on the outside, or if you've got a water molecule that's on the inside, it can't easily get past because it can't get through that water-hating region, those hydrophobic tails, to get easily from one side to the other side. So when we're looking at the phospholipid bilayer, it's called that because it's made of two layers of phospholipids. Now, the fluid part, it's called a fluid mosaic. So that's another term often used to describe the cell membrane. It's a fluid mosaic, fluid in the sense that the individual phospholipids and the proteins. So this right here is a protein. This big gray thing right here is a protein. Here's another protein. These proteins and these phospholipids, they're not stationary. They're not static. They're constantly moving around each other. So they move around, and they kind of have this liquid-like look because they do. They have the ability to move. So that's where the fluid word comes in. Mosaic, because of the pattern that you see produced by all of these various proteins that are embedded in that phospholipid bilayer. So talking a little bit about some definitional terms here, intracellular versus extracellular, just making sure we're all on the same page with what these mean. So when we're talking about intracellular, we're talking about inside the cell. When we use the word extracellular, we're referring to something outside of the cell. So extracellular is all this white space out here, okay, that's on the outside of the cell. Now, the phospholipid bilayer, the cell membrane, separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. This membrane is also referred to as semi-permeable or selectively permeable, meaning it allows some substances to pass and not others. And it could be, does the cell need water at this time, or does it need to get rid of water at this time? So it may not be we never let this substance pass, or we always let this substance pass. It's what does the cell need? What is it trying to get rid of? So it's selectively permeable and semi-permeable based on the needs of the cell and the environment. It's involved in communication. The cell membrane has kind of like markers on the outside surface that kind of identify it as, this is who I am. This is what my role is. This is what my job is, whatever. This is even where, for instance, your blood cell types, you've heard of things like, oh, I'm type A, or I'm type B, or I'm type O, or I'm type AB. Those are markers on the outside, that are protruding off of that cell membrane that let the body know what blood type you have. Cell recognition. This is how cells identify as belonging to self versus foreign. So why does your immune system, why does it not attack your own cells? How does it know the difference between a cell that belongs versus a pathogen, a cell that doesn't belong. It's because of these markers that are part of that cell membrane. And when that goes wrong, when your immune system actually starts attacking its own cells, that's where you get autoimmune diseases from. So now we're going to take a look at the components of the cell membrane. So we've talked about how the cell membrane is it's made up of a phospholipid bilayer. So obviously the main component is a phospholipid. So just to remember again what the components are that make up a phospholipid. Now remember, it is a type of lipid. That's one of those four macromolecules that we discussed back in chapter 2. It is amphipathic, meaning it's got a hydrophobic region and it's got a hydrophilic region. One region that likes water, one region that doesn't like water. Now, the hydrophilic head, which is this area right here, which is represented by the red structure, it has that glycerol molecule. Remember, we said that was a chain of 3 carbon atoms all in a row, and a phosphate group, which is usually just represented a lot of times with a P with a circle around it. That's most often how it's represented, but you can see the whole molecule here. But these are the parts that make up that hydrophilic zone, the part that loves water. Now, this structure down here, these are those 2 fatty acid chains. And remember, a fatty acid chain was a series of carbon atoms with hydrogens all around. And we talked about how each one of these bends represents a carbon atom, and then it's got the correct number of hydrogen atoms, so that way every carbon has 4 things attached. And you can see that one of them is saturated, one of them is unsaturated, meaning it's got a double bond present. That's usually one of them will be saturated, one of them will be unsaturated. But these again are hydrophobic. Remember, these fatty acids don't like water at all. So when you're looking at the phospholipid, you need to know what part is hydrophilic, what part is hydrophobic. You need to know the head from the tail. And again, when you put them together, you've got your phospholipid bilayer. You have 2 layers of phospholipids. And when you put the tails together, they form the cell membrane. So again, this area of yellow tails on the inside here, that's the hydrophobic zone. So the zone where the heads are, they're hydrophilic. So you've got the hydrophilic area on the top, and then you got the hydrophilic area on the bottom. So the material or the extracellular area, the environment outside the cell, it likes water. The area inside the cell, it likes water. What doesn't like water is the membrane where the tails are, where something would have to pass through to get from one side of the cell to the other side of the cell. Another component that's found in the cell membrane is a cholesterol molecule. This structure right here, the yellow, is the cholesterol molecule. And if you can remember, cholesterol was also a type of lipid. When we took a look at the 4 macromolecules, cholesterol fell under the steroid type of lipid. Cholesterol was a type of lipid. Lipids was a type of macromolecule. And the specific type of lipid, remember we had many different types of lipids. The specific type of lipid that this cholesterol fell under was steroid. And we knew that the characteristic of a steroid was that it was a 4-ring structure. So you can see the 4 rings right here that make up the cholesterol molecule. You can see them in the picture as well. You can see those 4 rings. So without even knowing it was a sterol, without even having it as part of the name of the molecule, you should recognize, oh, okay, 4 rings, that's a steroid. This is going to be a type of lipid. So it is definitely a hydrophobic molecule, unlike the phospholipid, which does and doesn't like water. But if you notice where the cholesterol is, or what it's around the hydrophobic tails. So the hydrophobic tails of the phospholipid and the cholesterol being hydrophobic itself, they're all there together. Now, what it does is it keeps the membrane stiff. It kind of keeps it from falling apart and just kind of disintegrating and deteriorating. It also decreases water's ability to be able to move through this membrane. So if you have water on one side of the membrane, it is going to be very difficult for that water to pass through. And with that cholesterol being there embedded in that plasma membrane, that just increases it increases it to the point where water is really not going to want to pass through. Another major component that is found inside of the plasma membrane, which we've kind of talked about a second ago, you've got your phospholipids right here. You've got your phospholipid bilayer, the ones that are represented in yellow with the little squiggly tails. Um, and now you can also see the proteins. So, proteins, there are so many different functions of proteins. And remember, protein was its own category of macromolecules that we talked about. They had the building block of amino acids. Proteins had so many different functions. We really didn't talk about the functions of proteins because there's so many of them and everybody has their own function. So again, with each different type of protein found in the membrane, it has its own function. Things that generally that these proteins are able to do, they help transport molecules from one side of the cell to the other. So you see here, you've got a little transport particle, a little transport protein that's allowing things to pass from one side to the other side. Remember, we said water really cannot pass through the cell membrane. However, it can go through a protein. So it can't, if you've got water sitting out here in the extracellular environment, it cannot pass through the phospholipid bilayer because it's got those hydrophobic tails. But it could pass through, for instance, if this was a specific type of protein that allowed water to pass through, it could pass through a protein to get from one side of the cell to the other side, which in fact it does. It's involved in communication. So again, there are markers out here on these proteins that kind of let all the other cells know what that cell's job is, that it's supposed to be there, it's part of self. You also have proteins that are communicating with other cells. So right here, you've got this example of one cell communicating with another cell. For instance, this cell right here could be sending out a red flag that says, hey, I'm infected with a virus. You need to come do something. And so another cell will join up with that when it recognizes that this cell is sending off this signal saying, hey, come help. Another cell will come to the rescue and kill it. So that way it doesn't pass on that virus. So we're not going to get into all the different parts of these proteins and their functions. We're going to talk more about this in chapter 12, to be honest. But I do want you to know that there are proteins that are found in the cell membrane. Now, there are two types of proteins. You've got what's called integral proteins and peripheral proteins. And this is really just talking about where they're located in the cell membrane. So if we're talking about a peripheral proteins are found only on the periphery. They're only going to be visible from one side of the cell. They're either going to be visible from the outside of the cell or from the inside of the cell. These peripheral proteins are not going to pass from one side to the other side. They're only going to be present on one side. Now, the integral proteins, these, if you notice, are visible from both sides. So they pass through the cell membrane. Okay, so they span the entire width of that cell membrane. And the last component that you're going to see in a phospholipid bilayer in the cell membrane are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, again, are their own macromolecule. So we've basically hit, within the cell membrane, we've hit 3 of the 4 macromolecules. We found carbohydrates there, we found proteins there, and we found lipids there. 2 different types of lipids, phospholipids and cholesterol. Carbohydrates are identifying molecules. So these are the ones that I was talking about a minute ago that kind of let all the other cells know that this is part of self. So for instance, with the ABORH groups and things like that on red blood cells, these are these carbohydrate chains. Okay. Now, these are only found on the outer surface of the cell membrane. So notice you don't see any down here. Okay, because we don't need to tell the inside of the cell who we are. We just need to tell the outside of the cell who we are so all the other cells know. So there's not any kind of question that, what its job is and if it's supposed to be there or not. And this is just a big picture. It really shows that fluid mosaic, how you've got everything integrated into this one picture and very diverse with all of the different components that that are found within the plasma membrane. If you need a review, there are 2 websites here. If you have not taken a look at Khan Academy is an amazing website. It is free, doesn't cost a thing, and they have got all different kinds of little lessons. So you can Google something like cell membrane Khan Academy, and it'll send you to links so that way you can watch it and see what's going on. Another one again is Armando Hasudigan, and it's also free. Okay, so we're going to stop there for today.